So like Kathleen mentioned, I'll be talking about our composting pilot program today. So these are our learning objectives. We're just going to be exploring the steps necessary to receive buy-in from environmental health and safety, analyzing all of the impacts of composting from the financial, political, and environmental impacts. And when I use the word political, I'm referencing institutional politics, identifying unique methods to avoid some barriers to animal bedding composting. We'll be talking about that as well. And then planning the next steps to develop a pilot animal bedding program that has longevity embedded within it. So before we jump in and talk about animal bedding composting, I think it's really important that we define what composting is. And so the NRDC in 2020 defined compost as the natural process of recycling organic matter into a valuable fertilizer that enriches soil and plants. So it's important to remember that animal bedding is an organic material. If an organic material gets sent to the landfill, that's going to generate methane, which can have between 28 and 80 times more of a heating capacity than carbon dioxide. And that's because landfills don't have oxygen. Composting occurs in the presence of oxygen. So if you break anything organic, like animal bedding, down in the presence of oxygen, you can have this nutrient-rich material that can be used. It's still producing that carbon dioxide byproduct, but it's nowhere near as strong as methane. And I also want to mention that this is different from biodegradable. Some places will talk about how materials can be biodegradable. And all that means is that it has the ability to break down. Now, some places don't necessarily define what breakdown means, but if something is compostable, it means it can be turned back into an organic material. So really important to note as you're looking at potential biodegradable plastics and things like that. So let's talk about composting in research environments, since our animal bedding at the University of Alabama at Birmingham generated in research environments. So there are very few compostable materials that are found in research labs, like I just mentioned. Some items might be labeled as biodegradable or constructed from bioplastics. That doesn't mean they're compostable. If they don't turn back into an organic material that can be used, it isn't really compostable. And then almost all labeled items cannot be composted in a commercial composting facility. So even if something is labeled as BPI compostable, it has to be composted in a commercial composting facility. That means that it has to be an industrial center that can generate certain levels of heat and processes to compost the compostable plastics. And so if you're exploring compostable plastics, just know reusables are a good alternative to those bioplastic options. But the problem is that there's one material that doesn't have a reusable alternative, and that's animal bedding. In research institutions like University of Georgia, UT Austin, and UAB, we have to use animal bedding to take care of the animals. And so it's considered difficult to compost because of all of the hazards that are associated with animal bedding, the regulatory entities. Nina just did a fantastic job of talking about just how many regulations there are, and it varies by state. And then there are federal regulations too. And coupling the costs associated with composting and the regulations, you start to identify some logistical hurdles. And that's even when you don't consider in waste segregation from contamination. I'm using contamination, how Lindsay uses contamination, making sure there aren't plastics in the animal bedding, and then trying to identify a composter. So we'll talk all about that now. So I'm really a big believer in storytelling when giving these types of presentations. So we're going to be going on a journey. So the journey begins in 2019 when we learned from others. And then I presented my learnings to environmental health and safety in 2020. We identified a composter in 2022. And here in 2024, I'm discussing the lessons with you. So, like I mentioned, in 2019, we learned from others. I attended an I2SL presentation. It wasn't Education Week, but it was at the actual I2SL conference in Denver, Colorado. The University of Georgia, MIT, University of Virginia, and I believe Emory University did a presentation on composting in October of 2019. And I learned what to do, and more importantly, what not to do to have a successful composting program. A lot of the times when people do these presentations, sometimes it can be so cut and dry. We did X, Y, and Z. It worked perfectly, and here's how you can do it too. And what I love about I2SL and the community that we've built, and that I2SL has fostered so excellently, is that everyone shares all of their approaches, what worked and what didn't work. So that way it increases the likelihood of success. Because the universities I mentioned presented on what was successful and what wasn't, I was able to emulate and build off of what they did at UAB and apply it there. And so I engaged with the presenters to see what steps to emulate. And Star, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention her. She was one of these presenters. So any success that we have at UAB regarding animal bedding and composting can most certainly be attributed to her. She was so instrumental in helping. So after I engaged with the presenters, we then had to identify the knowns and the unknowns. So some of the knowns were that EH&S approval was a prerequisite because of the hazards associated with animal bedding. Research support was helpful, but not necessary. And that's mostly because of how our animal bedding facilities operate at UAB, and we'll get into that in a little bit. We had to know the compost operations and supplies were cost prohibitive. That's one reason why composting can be so challenging, like we discussed. And then one of the other knowns was coordination across departments was instrumental to long-term success. So making sure that sustainability was coordinating with environmental health and safety, and they were working with our animal facilities. Some of the unknowns: how much was it going to cost? We know it's cost prohibitive, but what's the total implementation cost? What are the what's the proper process? Are we going to have internal composting, or are we going to do, external composting? How much waste are we going to have to segregate? Is there a lot of contamination in our animal facilities, or is it going to be a pretty seamless process? What role will the researchers play? We knew that their endorsement would be helpful, but it wasn't necessary. But we weren't sure just how embedded they would be into the process. And then how do we integrate composting into facilities operation? In order for us to have a composting program that lasts the test of time, we wanted to try to make sure that it was integrated into the existing animal facilities operations. That way, we weren't fundamentally transforming operations and making it more difficult to be change makers. And then finally, what was the hazardous risk? And this was unknown, particularly because, like many other research institutions, certain bedding is going to be treated in different ways. When you're breeding mice, a lot of the time that bedding won't be considered hazardous in Alabama, but if your mice are being subjected to a virus or a bacteria, that bedding will. And so what type of processes are we going to be doing to ensure that none of the hazardous bedding gets composted? Now, a very important caveat to mention is that these are the known knowns and unknowns. Whenever you start any program, it's so critical that you identify the knowns and unknowns, but it's even more important, in my opinion, to identify these are known knowns and unknowns. So how do you address the unknowns? What we did at UAB was we met with the director of the Animal Resource Program to determine the composition of the animal bedding, so what type of specific wood it was made from, and to make sure it was not treated, so that way it could be composted. If it were chemically treated, it wouldn't be compostable. We wanted to make sure that we could identify the facility. We wanted to determine what the current animal bedding disposal process was, and then what were the safety concerns of composting. So in order to address some of these unknowns, we had an EH&S meeting. And the goal of meeting with EH&S was to discuss the animal bedding composting initiative, to identify how hazardous bedding was already being handled and segregated, and to identify any potential barriers to diverting animal bedding from landfill to a compostable facility. And that's not just to make sure that we're crossing all T's and dotting all I's in the regulatory process, but we also wanted to make sure that we were getting all of the different key stakeholders' perspectives just to help us make sure that this could be a really successful pilot. And so we met with the Biosafety Committee of Environmental Health and Safety in February of 2020. For all of us post-COVID, we now know that that month was so significant, and I'm really grateful that I was able to get in February of 2020. I probably wouldn't be giving this presentation had it occurred any later. So what were some of the concerns that environmental health and safety had? waste streams. They wanted an update from the animal resource director to make sure that they fully understood what were the current hazards regarding animal bedding. They also wanted to say what would be the protocol in case hazardous bedding was disposed in the compost. Then they had questions and concerns about the protocol. What was the proposed protocol for composting the animal bedding and segregating the waste streams? And then, of course, the impact. Would transitioning and doing all of this work to make sure our animal bedding was being sent to a composting facility instead of a landfill actually have a sustainable, substantial impact? Because otherwise, why would we do all of this work? And so the Animal Resource Program Director and myself responded to environmental health and safety's concerns. So the ARP director said that there was minimal hazardous waste concern since most animal bedding was being generated from breeding mice, and the animal bedding that was being used in hazardous settings were being directly incinerated by a vendor off campus. And there's no existing protocol for if hazardous bedding is sent to landfill. If there's improper disposal, the ARP director, Animal Resources Program Director, was very, very confident in our abilities to properly dispose of animal bedding. But his point was that just adding compost doesn't change the risks associated with improper disposal of disposing of hazardous animal bedding. In fact, animal bedding, when composted, can reach 140 degrees Fahrenheit for composting. So that can actually kill a lot of bacteria and viruses, whereas sending it to landfill doesn't. And then protocol. So I told EH&S that we wanted to operate within the existing parameters for animal bedding disposal with just minor adjustments, like an additional dumpster, signage, things like that. Essentially launching an engagement campaign with the people who were staffing our animal facilities rather than fundamentally transforming how animal bedding was handled and disposed of on campus. And then what was the impact? So the research facility that we opted to implement our composting program accounted for about 60% of all animal bedding generated on our campus and generates approximately 7 tons of bedding per week. So it's pretty substantial. So this is our current disposal process. The mice are moved out of the cage, one cage to another during cleaning. The cage is then moved to a wash facility and in our animal facility building. All cage contents are then dumped. So animal bedding, paper housing, things like that, all dumped into the same container, including water packs. So if you're not familiar with water packs, they're just plastic bags that the rodents drink from. That was left in the bin. This is all consolidated into a 40 cubic yard compactor. And those water packs, if they had a little bit of water, what that would do is that would cause water to pool at the bottom of the compactor as it compressed the waste. And so we were paying for a lot of our waste to be hauled, and we get charged by weight, and a lot of it was water. And the water was actually fermenting the animal bedding, causing really strong odors. And since implementing the composting pilot program, people have reported fewer headaches because the odor isn't as strong in the building, which is great. And then, of course, it was sent to landfill. So this was the previous disposal process, and we amended steps 3, 4, and 5. So mice were still being removed from their cages. The cages were still being moved to the wash facility, but now the cage contents were separated and dumped. Any plastic waste that was left in the cage were segregated into different waste bins, and then the animal bedding and the paper huts and anything else that was compostable was left in the cage and then dumped into a different container, which was then put in our compactor. So our compactor was just then filled with things that could be composted. And then it was sent to a compost facility in the Birmingham metro area. And then it's emptied just like everywhere else. And so the compost facility that we identified was located right outside. It was 25 miles away from campus, which was about the distance that our landfill was located, which meant that we weren't going to have to pay more in hauling costs. They were willing to charge us the same tipping rates as landfills, about $30 a ton in Alabama, to help us assist in funding the compost initiative. We were just waiting to receive final licensing from the state to permit commercial composting from large businesses. And it was anticipated to be approved and running within 6 months of meeting with EH&S, which would have been August of 2020. So this was all coalescing to be this crescendo of, all of our segregating was going to be perfect. People will have the opportunity to really hone their skills in segregating the waste. EH&S would have approved this. And right as we finished making sure everyone was trained and EH&S finalized approval, this composting facility was going to be operating. And so then we started working and developing training. We designed signs like what's to the right. This was actually is what's used in the facility. This is mounted everywhere in the animal facility cleaning rooms. And then it was mounted on the compactor for a final reminder. It was approved by the composting facility, and it was developed in collaboration with UAB Sustainability and Environmental Health and Safety. And so I've got this little video. I'm going to go ahead and see if it'll play. It's of the disposal process. It says it's loading. Anyway, so we launched an engagement campaign in the animal facility. Non-compostable items were segregated into a separate dumpster. And then the next step was waiting for the compost facility to then receive their final licensing. So you can see on the left, they're scraping the contents out, making sure there's no animal bedding residue. And those are all dirty cages on the left. The person on the left is making sure there's no plastic contamination in those cages. He tossed a plastic contaminant into a separate bin, and the animal bedding goes into the bin on his left. And that's how we were able to seamlessly segregate compostable waste from non-compostable waste in an animal facility before they go through the cage wash process. And so then we wanted to make sure that we were actually segregating our wastes properly. So we verified the effectiveness of the engagement campaign by photographing waste from the compactor. So our hauler hauled this compostable material to the landfill before we sent it to a compost facility. And I asked them to have their driver take a photo. I knew that, we couldn't find any gloves or any colorful plastics if there was any contamination. And you can see that, you don't see any clear materials there. So no water packs, no blue gloves, no trash bags that were black. It's just all animal bedding and paper products, which illustrates that the facility did wait for the composting facility to receive final licensing from the Alabama Department of Environmental Management. And so we waited and waited and waited, and the company filed for bankruptcy. It liquidated. So after more than 1 year of us waiting for their licensing, they told us that they couldn't take the animal bedding and they were going to cease all operations. So we were now tasked with finding a facility to compost animal bedding after training all personnel to separate waste streams. So our institution did all of this work, and we weren't able to compost because this company was no longer able to commit to composting our animal bedding or composting anything for that matter. And we weren't able to do any internal composting because UAB is an urban campus and there's nowhere to compost 7 tons of animal bedding a week. And so an out-of-state partnership would be required to effectively compost our animal bedding, because the image on the right is a map of all licensed composting facilities in the state of Alabama. So despite being an agricultural state, I promise your eyes aren't playing tricks on you. That is just a blank image of the state of Alabama. There's not one licensed composter in the state of Alabama as of 2024. So as of this presentation, there still is not a licensed composter in the state of Alabama. So because we were going to have to go out of Alabama to compost, we really wanted to make sure that we were still doing the most environmentally responsible action. So I used the waste reduction model from the Environmental Protection Agency called WARM that helps quantify waste associated emissions. And what I was able to do was I was able to calculate that we would still be we would still have negative emissions if we composted our animal bedding, so long as we were within a 300-mile radius from our campus. If we went any further than 300 miles, it would no longer be net negative emissions, and it wouldn't be worth composting. And so we identified a new compost facility located in Wildwood, Georgia, which was approximately 150 miles away from campus. They were willing to receive our animal bedding for free, which was great. The facility was already licensed to receive animal bedding and to compost it under Georgia regulations, which was excellent. We started contract negotiations in late 2022. The anticipated hauling costs would be about $1,200 a haul. So quite expensive, but those costs and all other operating costs would be paid for by a previous sustainability initiative that had incurred substantial savings. So we had partnered with building services and facilities who pay for all of the university and hospitals' waste disposal, help them save about $2,200 a month. And so we could go to leadership and say, we want to allocate $1,200 of that $2,200 a month towards this pilot program. And they were more than willing to, since they were still saving $1,000 a month. But wait, there's more. So even after we were able to identify a new composter and we started negotiating a contract and we got approval from leadership to pay for the hauling, our contracted hauler would have to contract the hauling work out to cross state lines. Our hauler couldn't just cross state lines from Alabama to Georgia. And so this required a no-fault contract in the event of an interstate accident between our hauler and their hauler, just to make sure that whoever was at fault could be held accountable. And so while finalizing the no-fault contract, UAB's 10-year contract with our hauler lapsed. And because our contract with our hauler lapsed, they were not really interested in finalizing the no-fault contract until an extension of the UAB contract was finalized. And so finally, in late October, the contract was finalized and we received approval from all parties to begin hauling animal bedding in November of 2023. The agreement that we have with the composter cites that we will get fined if there's any contamination, and so far we have not been fined. So in the composter in Wildwood, Georgia has told me it's been going well. And so ultimately, if you're looking to try to build a composting program, or really any program, it's really important that you know your knowns and unknowns. The cost of the program, you have to try to mitigate costs as much as possible. You should review the current animal bedding disposal processes and try to develop a plan that works within the existing parameters. Engage with EH&S stakeholders before meeting with any EH&S committee. This kind of goes without saying, just because it's really important to show that you value their input, but also it helps identify any concerns that may be discussed during a committee meeting. And then you have to determine the overall environmental impact and benefits of composting animal bedding. Now, of course, it's also important to try your best to know what you don't know and find the answers along the way. Most people won't want to provide you with precious time if you haven't ironed out a lot of the issues ahead of time. You don't really want to go to leadership and say, oh, I want to compost animal bedding, but I don't know how much it's going to cost. I don't know how we're going to do it logistically. And I don't know what hazardous concerns there might be from environmental health and safety. And that's a waste of their time, and it's going to be really difficult for leadership to justify endorsing this idea. But if you can say, I know how much it's going to cost, I know the concerns or an idea of the concerns that environmental health and safety will have, and I have a broad idea of what the logistics will look like as to how we'll segregate the waste and how we'll actually compost it, help you with more buy-in. And you can even say, but some of the things I don't know are X, Y, and Z, but I'm working to identify those along the way. So you also have to accept the unknown unknowns. So like I mentioned on the last slide, talking to leadership and saying, I don't know X, Y, and Z, but I'm working on those answers, that can help provide you grace, but it also helps leadership further endorse your idea, because it illustrates that you know your knowns and you know your unknowns, but that you're truly trying to come up with a long-term solution to animal bedding composting by accepting your unknown unknowns. There will be things that happen unexpectedly. Accept this reality and be as dynamic as possible. Our journey began in 2019 and took nearly 5 years before we fully flushed out an animal bedding composting program. And it's not even campus-wide yet. It's still just operating at that facility. And of course, make significant changes in waste disposal takes time and effort, even if you're operating within existing parameters. Expecting anything otherwise is going to lead to disappointment. And of course, timelines are never linear with any initiative. There will be setbacks. And so on the right, I include a squiggly line because there's never anything that's linear. You never start your journey, make progress, and then complete your journey. You will have setbacks, but you'll also have successes.